Federalist, James Madison, says applicable to the pursuit of DC statehood, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government, carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislature of the Union, I might say of the world, by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulted, and its proceedings be interrupted with impunity, but a dependence of the members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of the government, for protection in the exercise of their duty, might bring on the national councils an imputation of awe or influence, equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy. And he says, this consideration has the more weight, as the gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of the government, would be both too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state, and would create so many obstacles to a removal of the government, as still further to abridge its necessary independence. Federalist, Alexander Hamilton has warned about the operations of nations in the collective bodies of society, apparently to cause a new social experience for democratic change, saying, the causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. There are some which have a general and almost constant operation upon the collective bodies of society. Of this description are the love of power, or the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, or the desire of equality and safety. There are others which have a more circumscribed, though an equally operative influence, within their spheres, such are the rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations. And there are others, not less numerous than either of the former, which take their origin entirely in private passions, in the attachments, enmities, interests, hopes, and fears, of leading individuals in the communities of which they are members. Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have in too many instances abused the confidence they possessed, and assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage, or personal gratification.
Let's not forget what's at stake here. Since I've started in this position, our movement has been like the Tower of Babel. Some people want autonomy. Some people want a vote. Some people want retrocession. This is our opportunity to speak with one clear, loud voice that statehood is what makes the people of the District of Columbia whole. Statehood is the remedy.
A Washingtonian named John Edward Ginnan left his role as a Roman Catholic priest to help the homeless and become an anti-war activist by founding the Community for Creative Nonviolence. He is the one who authored and filed with the D.C. Board of Election in 1979, the Statehood Initiative, which is officially known as the District of Columbia Statehood Constitutional Convention Initiative of 1979. An advocate for self-government, he believed that statehood makes voting rights in the U.S. Congress possible, and accordingly, that statehood is possible by the pursuit of voting rights, and that neither detracts from the other. In that year, Pope John Paul II visited U.S. President Jimmy Carter at the White House in Washington, D.C. President Carter drew from the writings of the pontiff and spoke sincerely for religious liberty in his public address. And notably, on helping to establish relations between the Pope and the Jews, he wrote in shorthand, "I feel lonely, not catastrophe for Pope to be embarrassed." In November 1980, D.C. Statehood Initiative No. 3 was approved by the city's voters, and became law after congressional review in March 1981 under President Ronald Reagan. It is stated in the writings of George Washington, that we should guard against the intrigues of any and every foreign nation, who shall endeavor to intermingle, however covertly and indirectly, in the internal concerns of our country, or who shall attempt to prescribe rules for our policy with any other power, if there be no infraction of our engagements with themselves, as one of the greatest evils that can befall us as a people, for, whatever may be their professions, be assured, fellow citizens, and the event will, as it always has, invariably prove that nations as well as individuals act for their own benefit, and not for the benefit of others, unless both interests happen to be assimilated, and when that is the case there requires no contract to bind them together, that all their interferences are calculated to promote the former, and, in proportion as they succeed, will render us less independent. And, indeed, I do not believe that Providence has done so much for nothing. It has always been my creed that we should not be left as an awful monument to prove that mankind, under the most favorable circumstances for civil liberty and happiness, are unequal to the task of governing themselves, and therefore made for a master. Protestant, Anna Ella Carroll, a descendant of the Carroll family of New Carrollton, Maryland, was Civil War advisor to the Lincoln administration's War Department, yet, she was not fully recognized by Congress for lack of documented evidence. The two prominent members of the Carroll family are Roman Catholic. 1. Daniel Carroll. He signed the U.S. Constitution of 1787, and served as a U.S. representative in Congress. Also, he contributed to the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights with the words, "or to the people." The other family member is John Carroll. He became the first Roman Catholic Archbishop of the United States. He was a trusted citizen, who was not appointed as an agent from Rome. Instead, he was proposed to the Vatican by the Roman Catholic people in the interest of the civil and religious liberty of the United States of America for the diverse people. In her book Star of the West, first published in 1856, she warns the United States about the pursuits of the Universal Church of Rome by the following. She quotes an editor who says, "We want to make Rome the District of Columbia for all Christendom." And based on a French paper called The Universe, which was the most influential paper in all of Europe, she says that the avowed sentiments of the papists in America is, to make Rome the District of Columbia for the whole world, and the Pope the interpreter of the Constitution of the United States. And accordingly, she says that through the papal bull, he lays his curse and his claim on all the civil and religious rights of man. He claims jurisdiction over armies, navies, seas, lands, treasures, coasts, etc., and she says, the field is chosen by the papacy, the plans are laid, the agents are commissioned not to faint or halt. America is to be the field on which the last great battle of the world is to be fought. The struggles of Rome will be in proportion to the value of the object, and the greatness and majestic splendor of the prize. Never were motives more impulsive and commanding, never was an issue when the victory will be more coveted and magnificent, and the results so striking and extensive. Now, my countrymen, by the very highest Roman Catholic authorities on earth, we have exposed the design and tendency of this corporation to subvert civil and religious liberty and law. What is subversion? Subversion is the undermining or detachment of the loyalties of significant political and social groups within the victimized state, and their transference, under ideal conditions, to the symbols and institutions of the aggressor. Subversion refers to an attempt to transform the established social order and its structures of power, authority, and hierarchy. Subversion is actions designed to undermine the military strength, economic strength, psychological strength, or political strength or morale of a governing authority. Subversion is a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the nation or geographical area of your enemy by demoralizing the cultural values and changing the population's perception of reality. Street planning in the District of Columbia, completed in 1956, shows intrigue and subversion through papal imperialism in the nation's capital city, the seat of government for the United States of America, which is 100 years after the first edition of the publication, Star of the West, by Protestant, Anna Ella Carroll. The papacy is delineated to be seated upon his throne of ecclesiastical and civil authority, while facing the Soldiers' Home of the Union, and President Lincoln's cottage. The Old Soldiers' Home is where President Lincoln received and sent war correspondence during the summer months. Notably, during the U.S. Civil War, Papal pursuits of temporal sovereignty were renewed in the Western Hemisphere when a Roman Catholic monarchy was established in Mexico in 1864 under Emperor Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria against the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. In 1847, at the petition of the bishops of the United States, Pope Pius IX named the Blessed Virgin Mary Patroness of the United States under her title of the Immaculate Conception. The following quotes are from the encyclical of Pope Pius IX on February 2, 1849, entitled, On the Immaculate Conception. We define as a dogma of the Catholic Church that the Most Blessed Virgin Mary was conceived immaculate and free in every way of all taint of original sin. Great indeed is our trust in Mary. The resplendent glory of her merits, far exceeding all the choirs of angels, elevates her to the very steps of the throne of God. Her foot has crushed the head of Satan. Set up between Christ and his church, Mary, ever lovable and full of grace, always has delivered the Christian people from their greatest calamities and from the snares and assaults of all their enemies, ever rescuing them from ruin. And God has committed to Mary the treasury of all good things, in order that everyone may know that through her are obtained every hope, every grace, and all salvation. For this is his will, that we obtain everything through Mary. But the Universal Church of Rome intended that the patronage of the Virgin Mary expressed in this encyclical would be through the Immaculate Conception of papal sovereignty over the United States of America, which is from the heart of the Virgin Mary, as the Pope claims to be the vicariate of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, that is to say, the delegated substitute of Jesus Christ the Son of God, according to the integral system of the Vatican City-State, which is for his dignity as a political and religious power, and civil and ecclesiastical authority according to Roman Catholicism. Google Maps shows 3 major hospitals of the nation's capital city for the general welfare are within the mitre and crown of the papal power of Rome. They are MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital, Veterans Affairs Medical Center, Children's Hospital and Children's National Medical Center. And Google Maps shows the papal power of Rome grimacing with the wink of the evil eye, the eye of malice, which is in the direction of George II, King of England. This image delineates a sexual assault on Protestant King of England, George II, by the Jesuit army, over the Act of Settlement that excluded Catholics from the throne. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was re-elected. Then, in the following presidential election, the first Roman Catholic, John F. Kennedy, was elected president, beginning the 100th anniversary of the U.S. Civil War. On April 27, 1961, President John F. Kennedy addressed the American Newspaper Publishers Association at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, and spoke of a Cold War conspiracy, saying,
"For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
Does the 1961 speech by the first Roman Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, indicate that he knew about the 1956 intrigue and subversion against the United States, and the United States of America found out and conspired to assassinate him? It is doubtful he did not know, but to find and know that the 1956 intrigue and subversion was President Kennedy's purpose gives reason for assassination. While visiting the Vatican in 1963, Pope Paul VI presented a pieta to President Kennedy as a gift, which is the crucified body of Jesus laying on Mary's lap. Jesus' death was through the political power of Rome, and Mary represents the fraternal patronage spirit of members, who operate in behalf of the interests of the Universal Church of Rome. Yet, President John F. Kennedy publicly distanced himself from any show of allegiance or homage to the cause of political power and civil authority claimed and pursued by the Pope. Moreover, based on the 1956 intrigue and subversion of the Roman Church in our nation's capital city, it is without doubt that assassination was anticipated, and Jesuits were at least involved in any assassination conspiracy. This painting, depicting the assassination of President Kennedy arriving at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas, is called Pieta by Mark Balma. It was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral for 7 days in Minnesota on the 50th anniversary of his assassination. The death of President John F. Kennedy is identified with the death of Jesus Christ, but which is according to Roman Catholic teaching. According to the 4 Gospels of the Bible, Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, put in a linen cloth and carried to a nearby tomb, and 2 women, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jose, followed, and saw how his body was laid in the tomb, and sat facing the tomb while they prepared his body for burial. And while in Rome, President Kennedy spoke beneath a banner, which depicted a lamb, called Agnus Dei, which means Lamb of God. An Agnus Dei medallion was given to John Wilkes Booth before he assassinated President Lincoln, which was found on his person after his death according to George Washington Baird, who became Rear Admiral of the Navy. He was an eyewitness of John Wilkes Booth's body on the warship called the Montauk, but he says that the medallion was later lost while in the possession of naval personnel. The possession of an Agnus Dei medallion indicates that John Wilkes Booth sacrificed himself when he risked death to assassinate President Lincoln in behalf of the Universal Church of Rome. And it is without doubt that the first Roman Catholic presidency was intended to be for the cause of the Universal Church of Rome, to strengthen the integral system of the polis by carrying out an objective. What is the polis? The polis is the city-state system of the Vatican for its integral political and religious power and civil and ecclesiastical authority over the world, under the vicariate of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, that is to say, under the Pope as the vicar or substitute of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In the 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate Chapter 6, Section 7, Paragraph 1, the papacy asks his followers to make the complex of institutions that give structure to the life of society, juridically, civilly, politically and culturally, a polis, or city for the common good. And that any vocation and according to the degree of influence he wields is to be considered in the polis, and contributes to the building of the universal city of God, which is the goal of the history of the human family. This is, and was the metaphysical approach used to restore and expand the integral system of the Universal Church of Rome, when John Fitzgerald Kennedy was President of the United States. Although John Wilkes Booth spoke against freedman citizenship as a Confederate, the Roman Church knew that the newly freed millions of black citizens could never give the integral system of the Vatican democratic favor. Therefore, the Roman Church would need to manipulate discrimination to its advantage, which is evident in 1956, the year of intrigue and subversion in the United States by the Universal Church of Rome. Intra-Catholic civil rights organizations, namely, the Southeastern Regional Interracial Commission, CIRANCO, and Commission on Human Rights, CHR, disbanded and were dissolved in 1956 by pressures from the Roman Catholic Church because of suspicion of communism, unrelenting discrimination by a Roman Catholic layman organization, and violence. Then, that same year, Jesuit Archbishop of New Orleans, Joseph Francis Rummel, used his political and religious power and civil and ecclesiastical authority against segregation. He integrated segregated Loyola University still resistant, threatened to excommunicate members of the laymen's organization established to relentlessly discriminate if it did not dissolve, and it did, and he also threatened to excommunicate legislators, who legislated against entitlements in integrated schools. Based on the aforesaid, if an act by a legislator is against the doctrines of a church, which is identified as a sin, they may be excommunicated or disfellowshipped because it is a public act against the law of their God. But if the church tells a legislator what to legislate under threat, it is an exercise of political power and civil authority through that legislator, which is of the nature of temporal sovereignty. It is of the integral system of the Vatican. Yet, in the exercise of temporal sovereignty from its canon laws of the polis, it worked favorably for desegregation. But, the Archbishop exercised political power in the legislative process of state government to determine the decision-making of its legislators through its ecclesiastical authority. Therefore, this favorable act to desegregate, necessary for the pursuits of its own religion, was not the egregious act of a citizen alone. This exercise of power and authority is found to be a subversive act of a foreign city-state sovereign over the Republic of the United States of America, and for democratic inclusion of its discriminated people in the progression towards civil rights. Thereby, it created an opportune precedent unto the potential of canon laws of the Vatican City-State, which remain adverse to civil and religious liberty for a diverse people. E pluribus unum. Notwithstanding the simple sincerity of Roman Catholic members in their pursuits of equality and better conditions through desegregation, which should be factored. Yet again, the year, 1956, is significant because in that year, acts within the sphere of the Fraternal Roman Catholic Church neutralized its civil rights movement when it dissolved its organizations, and instead, provided an example of its own ability to bring equality and justice to its members, and entitlements in schools, by its political and religious power and civil and ecclesiastical authority. Near the start of the U.S. Civil War, unification of Italy threatened the temporal sovereignty of the papacy. Advocates of papal temporal sovereignty began to publish writings in order to justify the temporal sovereignty of Pius IX and to maintain his remaining patrimony. Also, a desperate Pius IX wrote an encyclical justifying his temporal sovereignty in order to maintain his remaining patrimony in Italy, and to thank those who supported and upheld the integral system of the Vatican, which is the political and religious power, and civil and ecclesiastical authority of the city-state system under the vicariate of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Pius IX says the following to the Universal Church of Rome. We cannot express in words what a consolation and what a joy to us, in the midst of the greatest unpleasantness, are your admirable loyalty and respect, and that of your faithful, for us and this apostolic see. We are referring to your truly outstanding unanimity, willingness, zeal, and constancy in defending the rights of this same see and the claims of justice. You vehemently denounced the sacrilegious attacks made on the civil power of the Roman Church. And defending constantly this dominion, you proclaimed and taught that God gave the civil power to the Roman pontiff, so that he, never subject to any power, might exercise in full liberty and without any impediment the supreme task of the apostolic ministry divinely committed to him by Christ our Lord. Notwithstanding the continual loss of the remaining patrimony of the papacy by the unification of Italy, at the start of the U.S. Civil War, correspondence from Secretary of State, Mr. William H. Seward to Mr. Rufus King, U.S. Ambassador to Rome says on April 29, 1861. Rome is protected by the veneration of a large portion of mankind for His Holiness as the expounder of faith and the guardian of religion. He is a friend to peace, to good order, and to the cause of human nature, which is now, as it always has been, our cause. Let the government of Rome set this example and exercise its great influence in favor of a course of natural justice among nations. And notably, in light of the continual loss of the papal patrimony, the U.S. ambassador was to assure the Vatican that, we will not violate the friendship already so happily existing by any intervention in the domestic affairs of the states of the Church, that it is the settled habit of this government to leave to all other countries the unquestioned regulation of their own internal concerns, being convinced that intrusion by a foreign nation anywhere tends only to embarrass rather than aid the best designs of the friends of freedom, religion, and humanity, by impairing the unity of the state exclusively interested. Upon the correspondence of the U.S. Secretary of State, an advocate of temporal sovereignty, Henry Edward Manning, who became the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster in 1865, wrote a publication in 1862 titled, The Temporal Power of the Vicar of Christ. He says that the pontificate and the sovereignty, spiritual and temporal, of the vicariate of Jesus Christ are an indivisible unity. And he says of this unity, as in treating of human nature we may contemplate the body and the soul, the intellect and the will, the expansion of life in childhood, its wider range in youth, its sway and maturity in manhood, and yet we are only distinguishing without dividing the integral and inseparable perfections and properties of one individual life, so it is with the sovereign pontificate of the vicars of Jesus Christ, whether contemplated lineally in the progressive manifestation of its prerogatives along the whole line of pontiffs, or in the person of Pius IX, in whom all the inheritance of the vicariate of the Son of God, both as pontiff and as sovereign, resides in full. And he says, it is one of the tactics of our adversaries to profess that they do not attack the spiritual supremacy, but only the temporal sovereignty of the Pope. By offering battle upon this ground, many are tempted to leave their true and sure position, and to give away, with their eyes shut, the key of their entrenchment, namely, that both the spiritual and the temporal, though given in different ways and at different times, are yet both gifts of the same divine Lord, and both inhere at this time, by the divine will, in the person of his vicar. If it be conceivable that he should have given the one without the other, now that he has given both, it is not conceivable that they should be parted. The sovereign pontificate is conceivable to us only as God has manifested it. We receive its image from its manifestation. We have no other conception of it except as he has revealed it by his action upon the world. If it be said, we can conceive it as it once existed before the temporal power was known to this world, we answer, we may conceive it for that time, because God so manifested it then, we cannot conceive it for this, because God has manifested it otherwise now. But this manifestation is the will of God. In March of 1863, Judah P. Benjamin, the Secretary of State for the Confederate States of America, revealed the following to Jefferson Davis about the pursuit of Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. He conveyed, His Imperial Majesty aims steadily at the restoration of Mexico as it was prior to the independence of Texas. In the event of his success an empire would be created whose crown would perhaps satisfy the ambition of Jerome Napoleon and remove that red republican prince definitely out of the way of the Prince Imperial, to the joy of the Emperor and Empress. On April 14, 1864, Roman Catholic Emperor Ferdinand Maximilian was sent from Austria to Mexico to set an example of liberty in the West under Pius IX through the French government while the U.S. Constitution was vulnerable. But, on April 4, 1864, the United States House of Representatives had denied recognition to the Empire of Mexico, which overthrew the Mexican Republic. Under Pius IX, Emperor Maximilian was to end discrimination against Native Americans and promote equality. He provided for the general welfare in behalf of the poor with his own donation, and devoted time to personally listen to complaints, and decreed freedom of expressing opinions upon all official acts, but yet, he insisted upon maintaining entire freedom of conscience and worship, which is contrary to the temporal pursuits of the papacy. Therefore, the papacy wrote the emperor a letter dated October 18, 1864 that was received on March 18, 1865 in the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C. by Secretary Ignacio Mariscal. Quotes extracted say, Your Majesty is well aware that, in order effectually to repair the evils occasioned by the Revolution, and to bring back as soon as possible happy days for the Church, the Catholic religion must, above all things, continue to be the glory and the mainstay of the Mexican nation. To the exclusion of every other dissenting worship, no person may obtain the faculty of teaching and publishing false and subversive tenets. Instruction, whether public or private, should be directed and watched over by the ecclesiastical authority, that, in short, the chains may be broken which, up to the present time, have held down the Church in a state of dependence, and subject to the arbitrary rule of the civil government. As a statesman, James Madison has stated the following facts in his opposition to religious assessment. Torrents of blood have been spilt in the Old World, by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord, by proscribing all difference in religious opinions. Another fact is that the policy is adverse to the diffusion of the light of Christianity, the light of revelation, which resulted in Protestants separating from the Universal Church of Rome, and forming independent religious sects based on the restitution of biblical truths. The Confederate States were willing to aid France and Mexico against the United States for recognition of their own sovereignty, contrary to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which says of European political systems, "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers, to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety and happiness. Also, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny, by any European power, in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States." Yet, President Lincoln, who maintained separation of church and state, also guarded the southern border against an invasion, notably in order to take back Texas, which would have become a papal state, and would have divided the nation into the United States of America, Confederate States of America, and Papal States of America. But, 1 year later, on the day that Emperor Maximilian came to set an example of a rival liberty in the West, that's under Pius IX, on April 14, 1864, on Good Friday, April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State William Henry Seward were assassinated by conspirators, who met in the house of a devout Roman Catholic, named Mary Surratt, whose son was also a part of a kidnapping plot against the president. Only President Lincoln died from his wound by the assassin John Wilkes Booth, who was killed by Thomas P. Boston Corbett, a Union officer. Lewis Payne, the assassin of Secretary of State Seward, was executed, including Mary Surratt, and 2 others named George Atzerold and David Harold. In 1855, at the time that the nation was divided over slavery, and the territory of Kansas, Bleeding Kansas, was the place of civil conflict over the territory becoming a free or slave state, plaintiff, Peter Spink, represented by Charles R. Starr, accused defendant, Charles Chiniquy, of slander. He was a Roman Catholic priest, who became a Protestant. He was defended by lawyer, Abraham Lincoln. According to Chiniquy, the accusation of slander began after Roman Catholic Bishop Origen of Illinois declared the deed for St. Anne, intended to be a French Catholic colony by Chiniquy, was a fraud. He wanted it to be a more obedient Irish Catholic colony. Also, Chiniquy complained about Origen wanting him to accept corrupt priests as neighbors, one a French Roman Catholic priest named R. Lebel. As a result, the account is that Origen agreed with a speculator named Peter Spink to put Chiniquy in a jail cell. In the lawsuit of Spink, R. Lebel accused Chiniquy of attempted seduction and rape of his married sister in May 1855, which would damage her respectability. A woman, who overheard Lebel and his sister plot slander for an agreement of land, told Abraham Lincoln when she learned that Chiniquy was condemned to be hanged. Thereby, in 1856, Abraham Lincoln was able to successfully settle with Spink, which prevented him and the priests from perjuring themselves. During the trial proceedings, Abraham Lincoln insulted the priests by a remark about their celibacy, which resulted in outbreaks of laughter. After the trial, Chiniquy warned him with tears that Jesuits were there, and that they will assassinate him for defending him against their plot. Street planning in the nation's capital city, the seat of government for the United States of America, was completed in 1956, 100 years after the warning of Anna Ella Carroll about the pursuits of the papacy with our nation's capital city, and the case against Reverend Charles Chiniquy, who was represented by lawyer, Abraham Lincoln. Streets in the nation's capital city have names after states, and historic events and people. And they lead to memorials, monuments, statues, and parks, symbols of liberty and freedom, for learning about the history of the United States of America. But, this landscape image delineates the assassination of President Lincoln, who is a symbolic representative of our civil and religious liberty against the pursuits of the papacy, and of progression in human rights and civil rights, laying mortally wounded beneath a successor papal throne since 1956. This kind of speech is not cultural, religious, political, nor historically accurate. It is a symbol of papal imperialism. Not only does Roman Catholic intrigue show subversion of the civil and religious liberty of our nation by papal imperialism, it delineates an act of treason against the government by assassination of our president in behalf of that foreign sovereign's political religious system. This requires democratic change by causing a subversive new experience in its favor. But, this change is not a legitimate progression in the democratic process because of its violent and tireless pursuit against our liberty, which is near kin to inclusive nature herself for the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of diverse citizens and people, yet, according to the rectitude of intentions by laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Instead, this change is a means to an end of our national democracy under a republican form of government for the protection of inalienable rights. As stated earlier, subversion is the undermining or detachment of the loyalties of significant political and social groups within the victimized state, and their transference, under ideal conditions, to the symbols and institutions of the aggressor. Subversion refers to an attempt to transform the established social order and its structures of power, authority, and hierarchy. Subversion is actions designed to undermine the military strength, economic strength, psychological strength, or political strength or morale of a governing authority. Subversion is a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the nation or geographical area of your enemy by demoralizing the cultural values and changing the population's perception of reality. Article 3, Section 3, and Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution says, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. In the Federalist Paper No. 69, Alexander Hamilton indicates in other words that treason is all conspiracies and plots against the government, which has matured into actual hostility. Treason is to persevere in a designed enterprise against the public liberty with an appeal to arms and execution of the design against the government. In 1801, the second session of the 6th U.S. Congress enacted the following for Georgetown City, and said in Section 16, "And be it further enacted, that nothing in this act contained shall in any wise alter, impeach, or impair the rights, granted by or derived from the acts of incorporation of Alexandria and Georgetown, or of any other body corporate or politic, within the said district, except so far as relates to the judicial powers of the corporations of Georgetown and Alexandria." But, in 1871 the following was enacted concerning Georgetown City. D.C. Code Section 1-107 says, that portion of the district included within the limits of the city of Washington, as the same existed on the 21st day of February, 1871, shall be known as and shall constitute the city of Washington, the federal capital, and all general laws, ordinances, and regulations of the city of Washington are extended and made applicable to that part of the District of Columbia formerly known as the city of Georgetown. The title and existence of said Georgetown as a separate and independent city by law is abolished. It is evident by the papal attempt to restore temporal sovereignty during the U.S. Civil War that the nature of the papacy is to heal and avenge itself from the deadly wound of the French Revolution since 1798 upon the arrest and exile of Pope Pius VI on February 20, which resulted in the loss of all papal states by 1870 under Pius IX. And upon the discovery of papal pursuits in 1865 through Emperor Maximilian, on February 21, 1871, the county and city of Georgetown under Jesuit rule, was succeeded by the city of Washington and its municipality, the District of Columbia. Dates appear to be significant to the Vatican's healing process. In 1929, the Vatican's temporal sovereignty was restored on February 11 by the Lateran Accords, which is one day after Pius VI was demanded to renounce his temporal sovereignty 131 years before. Therefore, it appears that February 21 would be a significant date to the Vatican because it is one day after Pope Pius VI was imprisoned and exiled for not renouncing his temporal sovereignty 73 years before. It is without doubt that these dates are significant because the loss of Jesuit-controlled Georgetown City in 1871 is part of the domino effect since the 1860 encyclical of Pius IX, whereby he attempted to salvage his temporal sovereignty over his papal territories, which were unified under Italy. And in 2021, 150 years later, it will be the anniversary that the federal government abolished the city of Georgetown and annexed the territory into the city of Washington, under its municipality, the District of Columbia. Therefore, the year 2021 would be an ideal time to have the state of New Columbia to the Union. And this time fits within the 150th anniversary of the U.S. Civil War, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, and William H. Seward, U.S. Secretary of State, and Francis, the first Jesuit Pope, who promoted before the 2015 joint session of Congress, his common good, which is the integral system of the vicariate of Jesus Christ, the political and religious power for worldwide civil and ecclesiastical authority under his Vatican City-state sovereignty. Therefore, the monolithic image of the Pope of Rome seated upon his papal throne in the District of Columbia with the seat of U.S. government behind him as the holy enforcer of his religious dogma, is an expression of an attempt to restore and expand his city-state sovereignty in the Western Hemisphere by a papal state with the District of Columbia. In light of Jesus Christ, the cross of crucifixion was used to show subjugation, humiliation, and mockery of the inadequacy of one, whether a slave, or non-Roman, who committed a major crime or act against the law of Rome punishable by death, or who committed a high crime as treason against the kingdom or king of Rome. Evidently, the state of New Columbia is of a continued pursuit from the attempt to invade and restore Texas to the Roman Catholic Mexican monarchy, under the sovereignty of Roman Catholic France, directed by the will of Pope Pius IX during the U.S. Civil War. And again, during World War I through the Zimmermann telegram, it was learned of an attempt to restore to Mexico, its former territory in the U.S. through Germany, allied to the Roman Catholic Habsburg monarchy of Austria-Hungary, which would have divided the country of the United States with papal states. In 1917, during World War I, the highest mountain peak in Alaska named Denali was renamed Mount McKinley after William McKinley, the last of the U.S. Civil War Union officers, who served as U.S. President. President William McKinley, a brevet major in the Union Army, resisted European pressures to let Pope Leo III mediate and work out an armistice between menacing Spain and Cuba. Instead, after Spain sunk the patrol ship, U.S. Maine, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. went to war against Spain and gave Cuba independence. This date was exactly 100 years after France invaded Rome in 1798 and demanded Pope Pius VI renounce his temporal sovereignty, and February 15 is the day the monarchical government of Papal Rome was declared a republic. Notably, mediator between sovereign powers is one of the powers of the papacy and is expressly pursued in the 2009 encyclical, Caritas in Veritate. Although this power was restored under the Lateran Accords, according to the pacts with Italy, the Pope is only permitted to mediate if all parties agree. The imperialistic religious pursuits of the Universal Church of Rome manifest by intrigue in the United States of America is contrary to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, and to the spirit of the United Nations founded in 1945 after World War II, to which the Holy See is a non-voting observer state since 1964 with the privileges of a delegate as of 2003. The UN says, the UN is committed to maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations and promoting social progress, better living standards and human rights. In light of the liberty, justice, equity, and welfare pursued among the neighborhoods of nations, even through subversion, demoralization, and confusion that leads to chaos, even for religious sovereignty, the United Nations organization should consider exchanging the victor's wreath in the global symbol for the following, as U.S. President Abraham Lincoln has said after the U.S. Civil War, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thereby, national powers can contribute to the international and global welfare without the destiny of a monolithic power obtaining resources from nations as subsidiaries and distributing them as the true world political authority and global economic manager. In 1978, John Paul II expressed in his inaugural address that he had a spiritual mission for the happiness and peace of the world. He said, "Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid."
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, honorable members of the Congress, dear friends, I am most grateful for the invitation to address this joint session of Congress in the land of the free at the home of the brave.